Our next panel, our next presentation, will be discussing Cyprus today, featuring 5 esteemed individuals, including Andrew Novo, to discuss Cyprus as a key contributor to Eastern Mediterranean stability. Mr. Novo is the Associate Professor of Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. To discuss Cyprus as an important energy center, we have Erik Holmgren, the Director of the Office of Middle East and Asia Energy Diplomacy at the U.S. Department of State. And we have Dr. Simon Henderson, Senior Fellow and Director of the Bernstein Program on Gulf and Energy Policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and to discuss the evolution of Cyprus as an economic, business, and shipping hub, we have Aristos Constantine, Trade Counselor for the Cyprus Trade Center in New York. They will be moderated by John Sitilides, a geopolitical strategist and Senior Fellow for National Security, Foreign Policy, at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and an energy monster. So please welcome these 5 gentlemen to the stage.
All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, Zach, thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you, Nikolai Ragakis and the entire American Hellenic Institute team for inviting us all to share some of our thoughts and perspectives on the regional stability components of the U.S.-Cyprus relationship, and for putting together this conference in a very timely manner, because there are so many things to celebrate now regarding the U.S.-Cyprus relationship in ways that I think are utterly unprecedented in modern diplomatic history. What I'm going to do is just try to set the table very briefly and then open it up for our panelists. And with all due respect to AHI, I'm going to somewhat jumble the order and restructure it in a way that I think will provide very useful value to all of us here. And as we all know, the reason that we're here this year is because we are commemorating the 50th anniversary of the occupation, the invasion and occupation, ongoing that is, of the Republic of Cyprus. Of course, the bad news is that we have entered the 51st year of the occupation of Cyprus, and we applaud all of the Herculean efforts that are being made to try to make 51 perhaps the last year, or at least begin the pathway to ending the occupation. As Ambassador Kakouris mentioned, it's the dubious honor or distinction that the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus is the longest continuous running US peacekeeping force on planet Earth. Very unfortunate, and sort of a stain, I think, on the UN's peacekeeping record that we're at 60 years now and going. So, that's the bad news. The good news is that we have a U.S.-Cyprus relationship that is more robust, as many of our speakers mentioned yesterday, and as Ambassador Kakouris detailed earlier. We're really reframing the Cyprus issue here in Washington, which has been seen almost exclusively as a U.S., Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, East Med, Southeast Europe problem since 1974, going back to 1963. And we're placing it really in a new geopolitical framework. This is a maturing and flourishing relationship between the United States and Cyprus across almost every component of the diplomatic spectrum. We have the strategic dialogue. We had the visit of President Christodoulidis at the White House, the 3rd such visit in the history of the Republic of Cyprus. And we are looking now at Cyprus as one more very important partner in this arc of crisis. And can we get the map up, please, the first map? It's very important, ladies and gentlemen, to look at Cyprus not only through the prism of bilateral relations, but also from a regional perspective. Cyprus really is located strategically at the heart of what, unfortunately for the world today, is an arc of crisis. If you look north of Cyprus, north of the Black Sea, you have the 3rd year now, possibly entering the 4th year of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the disruption to Europe's security architecture as a result of that ongoing invasion. You have Iran's multiple assaults against Israel through Hamas in Gaza, through Hezbollah in Lebanon, and through the Houthis in the Red Sea that are cutting off global shipping through the Suez Canal just south of Cyprus. Of course, we still have the ongoing civil wars, plural, inside of Syria, just across the East Med from Cyprus. And you have this largely ungoverned nation state of Libya that's been in a state of civil war ever since NATO undertook to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi a little over 10 years ago, with massive human trafficking problems attendant for almost all of Europe as a result of that huge open sieve across all of northern Africa. And so we have here in many ways a very important US-Cyprus relationship that maybe in many ways begins on security and defense cooperation, but really branches out into so many different directions that we'll talk about here with our panelists. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, just a few days ago, 4 US senators visited the Andreas Papandreou Air Base in Paphos. John Cornyn of Texas, John Bozeman of Mississippi, Susan Collins of Maine, and Jerry Moran of Kansas, because we have US forces that are utilizing the air base in Paphos. We have now the building out of the Evangelos Florakis naval base in Mari. And we have the US playing a very important role in expanding a significant helicopter base for rapid deployment operations and civilian evacuation operations in the Levant, in the East Med, in the Middle East, all coming through Cyprus. Very important US-Cyprus partnership there. And as Ambassador Kalkouris mentioned earlier, we have this Cyclops initiative of law enforcement, customs, and counterterrorism training facilities in Larnaca for regional stakeholders in South Asia, in the Middle East, and in Northern Africa that use Cyprus sort of as a go-between because of the political sensitivity in many of these countries of dealing directly with the US government. So we have so much good news on the geopolitical front and on the economic front. So what I'd like to do is open up the discussion first with Andrew Novo to sort of flesh out the regional stability components of this discussion. And then we'll go to Aristos Konstantin to talk about the economic and financial story that is Cyprus today. And then we'll talk a little bit about the energy components of the US-Cyprus relationship, including the pipeline project and whether there's a renewed feasibility in the years ahead. And then we'll close out with some of the EEZ issues that are further complicating both a Cyprus solution and any energy infrastructure that might be built in the region. So I'll pass it now to Andrew, if you'll begin, and then we'll go to Aristos right afterwards. Andrew?
Great. Thank you very much, John. And thank you to Ahi and to Nick for the invitation. I would also just add before I begin that even though I work for the government as a professor at NDU, I don't speak for the government. I don't speak for the government. I don't speak for the Department of Defense. I don't even speak for NDU. So I'm here in my personal capacity as an academic and someone who's looked at these issues for some time. I want to just build a little bit on what John was discussing in terms of the geopolitical context for the region along sort of 3 main points, which I think provide a lot of foundational influence for what we see in the US-Cyprus relationship today. The first is just sort of general war and instability in the Middle East, which has obviously been a factor for quite a long time, but has ramped up recently in ways that make Cyprus more significant. But this goes back to at least the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war, the coalition against ISIS, which Cyprus is a part of, actually, the international coalition against ISIS. This is largely framed also by the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and of course, since October 7th of last year, renewed and very serious violence between Israelis and Palestinians. So you have that big piece right off of Cyprus in the Middle East that is a major factor of destabilization. You also have instability vis-a-vis Turkey, which I know we'll talk about in a lot of different ways, but just to put a couple of points on that. The United States and Turkey have not had the best relationship with regard to the situation in Syria, with regard to the Assad regime, with regard to ISIS, with regard to policy toward the Kurds in the region. That relationship was also traumatized by the attempted coup in Turkey in 2016. And there's additional instability in Turkey as well when we look at the role of the economy, of serious inflation in Turkey, a slowdown to its economy, which is of course a destabilizing factor, and of course the relationship between Erdogan and Putin, which seems to be very strange and untrustworthy as far as the United States or NATO is concerned. Since we're talking about Putin, that's the other big issue of instability in the region. In the excellent map that John drew up, maps are important depending on how much you focus them or pull them out or pull them in. And if you pull the map out just a little bit from Cyprus, you see not just the Mediterranean, but of course the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is enormously important, and it's obviously connected to the Mediterranean. You can talk to Turkey more about that. But of course, the war in Ukraine is essential to the security of the Black Sea. It's fundamental to the security of the Black Sea. And what we see in the war in Ukraine is another issue of instability in the region over Black Sea access, Black Sea shipping, Black Sea energy. And of course, that connects to the current crisis in Georgia, which I don't know how closely any of you are following, but with elections and election disputes in Georgia and protests, and I believe there's an enormous protest going on today or yesterday in Georgia and Tbilisi of university students now taking to the street and saying that they oppose the results of the election in Georgia and how it was managed. And of course, the war in Ukraine is putting enormous pressure on the European Union, right? It's putting enormous pressure on the European Union. It's putting enormous pressure on transatlantic relations. And of course, it's also putting pressure on another issue that we've heard before in this conference, the idea of international law, international norms, and greater global stability. And so those are the three sort of main points of instability that I'd want to highlight in the region. There are a couple of other factors which more hypothetical or not entirely formed in my mind, which we can talk about later. But in this, the U.S.-Cyprus relationship has been extremely strong, and I think that the general instability of the region contributes to a sense, both on the part of the U.S. government and of the Cyprus government, that this is a good time to be together. This is a good time to draw together, to think of ways to cooperate, to think of ways to contribute to stability amid so much instability. And of course, we've seen that in a number of ways. We've listed some of them before, but just to go through them again, joint military exercises, strategic partnerships, strategic dialogues at the very highest level, the bases that John was mentioning, the presence of American troops, the presence of EU, French ships coming to Cyprus, expanding the Marie naval base so that larger ships can come, the idea of collective security and collective defense, with Cyprus being a key place for it. And the last point I would mention on that is, this is because Cyprus is on the frontier, right? We don't necessarily think in terms of frontiers anymore, but Cyprus is a frontier state. This is the edge of the European Union. This is the limit of Europe. This is the last point. The European Union's writ doesn't go east of Cyprus. It's the frontier. And it's a kind of wild frontier, because the last point I would bring up is the Eastern Mediterranean is, and this is an argument, this is not a statement of fact, that it's the only place in the world where the four major powers of the world overlap in a substantive way. This is the frontier of Europe. This matters to the United States because of its relationship with Israel and its alliance with Turkey through NATO. So it's the sort of frontier of American power in a hard way. It's the frontier of the European Union because of Cyprus. It's relevant to Russia because of its bases in Syria and its access to the Black Sea, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And it's relevant to China because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so there's no other place I can think of in the world where the four major powers of the world overlap in this way. And that's why it's a very important region for American policy and for the idea of maintaining stability.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. Why don't we go right now into the Cyprus economy? We have Aristos Constantine.
Thank you, John. I've been tasked by Nick with the challenging endeavor of examining the evolution of Cyprus' economy over the last 50 years. And I know this conference is forward-looking, but I think it's worthwhile taking a moment to look back a little bit and to figure out how we got to where we are. I think it's worth also touching on the years following Cyprus' independence, and you'll see why. So after, as many of us here today are fully aware, after an armed struggle against British colonial rule, Cyprus became an independent state in 1960. However, it was granted a qualified sovereignty, burdened with guarantors and a problematic constitution, which soon became an obstacle to the smooth functioning of the state. Take into account also the fact that Beyond serving its own interests, a colonial state rarely pursues the development and betterment of the people it colonizes, and it did not do so in Cyprus. So in 1960, the fledgling government of Cyprus took over an anemic and underdeveloped economy. Yet, against all odds and despite the obstacles it faced, in the decade after gaining independence, its economy grew at an average of an impressive 7.1%. It achieved practically full employment and trebled per capita income. The success and strength built into the economy during this period helped Cyprus survive the near-mortal blow of the Turkish invasion and occupation. This year marks the 50th anniversary of that brutal invasion. I think it's difficult to comprehend the extent of the devastation that the Turkish invasion wrought on the economy and the social fabric of the country. From an economic standpoint, the invasion and occupation took with it over 70% of Cyprus's economic capacity. The majority of its agriculture, industry, tourism assets, and infrastructure, including the main port and airport, gone. A third of the entire population were expelled from their homes, fleeing south, desperately seeking refuge and survival, homeless, assetless, and jobless. As terrible as that sounds, it does not begin to fully describe the extent of the horrific reality of the invasion or its aftermath. Were you to read the report of the European Commission of Human Rights, adopted 10th July 1976, which describes in horrific detail the atrocities and crimes committed by the Turkish troops against the Greek Cypriots, you might begin to understand the depth and breadth of visceral ruin that the people of Cyprus endured. The war lasted until August 18th, 1974, and resulted in Turkey capturing 37% of the island. Approximately 210,000 people became refugees. Outside observers feared the total collapse of the economy and society. How could a country possibly recover, left with only 30% of its productivity and a third of its citizens homeless and destitute? But this crippled, small state overcame its shock, healed its worst wounds, and picked up the pieces. The Greek Cypriot people, with characteristic fortitude and determination, underwent an unbelievably swift revival and advance. Not only did Cyprus recover, it thrived once again. By 1978, just 4 years later, employment stood at only 2% compared with the 30% at the end of 1974. The average rate of growth of the economy reached 8.8%. By 1981, full employment was achieved, exports were increasing impressively, tourism was developing fast, foreign investments were high, and the per capita income exceeded pre-invasion levels, whilst its currency value was maintained. Considering that it was a country that had only gained self-determination a little more than a decade before, the adept handling of the situation by the government and the Cypriot people is even more impressive. This became aptly known as an economic miracle, and it would not be the last time that Cyprus would earn this accolade. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention, and many of the bold decisions and policies introduced to bolster growth in the aftermath of the invasion were to be formative for the future of the Cyprus economy. In 1975, Cyprus introduced a tax legislation aiming to attract international business companies to set up in Cyprus. The policy was extremely successful. It combined a simple and attractive tax system with a wide and continuously expanding network of favorable tax treaties. The Cyprus government understood that, combined with its geographic location at the crossroads of 3 continents, that it was in a unique position to provide access and to operate as a hub. This decision propelled Cyprus's legal, banking, and financial sectors to become important pillars and growth engines for the country, as they remain today. A fierce focus on education also has paid dividends and has resulted in Cyprus having one of the highest rates of tertiary education in the EU, producing a highly skilled and educated workforce. Our small island nation can boast of 2 Nobel Prize winners, Dr. Chris Pissaridis for economics in 2010 and Dr. Demis Hassabis, who earlier this year won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I could be wrong, but I think it might be one of the highest number of Nobel Prizes per population. I'll have to check that, but it seems plausible. Cyprus was also quick to recognize the political and economic importance of shipping. But in contrast to worldwide shipping practices, Cyprus created an open registry, allowing vessel owners from any nation to register their ships under its flag. Its success was rapid. In the early 80s, the world shipping industry saw profit margins shrinking and ship owners sought alternative ways to remain profitable. One way was to transfer the management of ships to Cyprus. With a low tax rate and a robust, experienced shipping sector, it provided an attractive value proposition. The Cyprus ship management industry grew by leaps and bounds. Another major milestone for shipping in Cyprus was achieved in 2004, when Cyprus joined the European Union and became the only officially approved country within the European Union with an open registry, giving the sector a further boost. Today, Cyprus is one of the largest shipping hubs in the world, with the third largest merchant fleet in Europe. Becoming an EU member state was a pivotal moment for Cyprus' economy, but also for its identity. On April 16, 2003, President Tassos Papadopoulos signed the Treaty of Accession of Cyprus to the European Union. In his speech at the signing, he stated, "The signing of this accession treaty constitutes a great and historic moment which seals indelibly Cyprus' future course. It constitutes, at the same time, the crowning achievement of a titanic effort by the Cypriot society, and it is the landmark of its acceptance by a family to which it belongs geographically, historically, culturally, economically, and politically." On May 1st, 2004, Cyprus became a full EU member state, and in 2008 joined the Eurozone and adopted the euro as its national currency. But shortly thereafter, in 2012, on the heels of the US and European financial crisis, Cyprus was faced with its own banking crisis. It's important to note that the problem that Cyprus faced was almost entirely due to the EU decision to haircut Greek debt by 50%, for which Cyprus banks were among the primary creditors. The losses were massive, equivalent to almost 20% of Cyprus's GDP. Equally important to note was the fact that whilst other nations benefited from EU bailout assistance, Cyprus was the only EU country to essentially bail itself out, with what became known as the bail-in. But once again, the Cypriot people, like Sisyphus, put their collective shoulders against the boulder and pushed it, uncomplaining, back up the hill. In unprecedented record time, Cyprus returned to financial markets and to growth, beating even the most optimistic projections, and for the second time was referred to as having achieved an economic miracle. Beyond the stoic tenacity and fortitude of the Cypriot people, many of the same factors that enable the Cyprus economy to be so resilient are also at the core of its appeal to foreign business today. Our robust common law legal system and regulatory framework, a simple, fully compliant and harmonized, transparent and fair tax system, common sense regulation and ease of doing business, an outward-looking economy able to bridge between regions, extraordinary human talent. Today, as an EU member state with a very sophisticated services sector, with deep ties and solid bilateral relationships with many important markets, Cyprus is increasingly viewed as an ideal hub for investment, trade, and regional operations, for European and US companies engaging in the wider region, or even other markets such as India. The same is true in reverse, that is to say, for non-EU interests wishing to enter the EU market. In fact, after Brexit, as one of the few remaining common law jurisdictions in the EU, one of the few benefits we gained from our time as a British colony, I think it would not be overstating to say that in some ways we are uniquely well positioned to become a preferred entry point for US interests into the EU market and further afield. Moreover, Cyprus itself is attracting increasing foreign investment, particularly in its rapidly growing tech sector, healthcare sector, and energy sector. I believe, without reservation, come what may, that the future that the Cypriot people have built for themselves through blood, sweat, and tears is bright. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Aristos. And so now we'll segue into one of the most astonishing and promising stories when it pertains to both Cyprus's economy and what it offers to Europe and the United States in terms of broader regional stability, and that's Cyprus's robust, well, hopefully robust energy sector, as we'll come to learn from our two experts. First, we'll hear the U.S. government position. Here representing the State Department is Erik Holmgren, and then we'll hear from Simon Henderson from the Washington Institute. So Erik, thank you very much for joining us. Microphone is yours.
Thank you. So first, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation. It's an important region. One of the things that strikes me too is often we don't think about it as a region, the East Med. Our Assistant Secretary Pyatt certainly does. He was ambassador to Greece for, I want to say, 6 years, which is pretty unprecedented. Prior to coming here, I was economic counselor in Athens, so it's a region that's kind of near and dear to my heart. One of the things that we try to do, even bureaucratically, if I can start there, which is really exciting stuff, but the way our State Department is organized is we have Cyprus in Europe, and we have Egypt and Israel in our Middle East Bureau. So fostering even communications on these important issues within our own bureaucracy is really important, and that's one of the things that our Assistant Secretary has been a lead on. He was a driver of the 3+1, which is a way to bring these countries together, because in many ways Cyprus has a lot more in common with its neighbors in Egypt and Israel than it does Norway. So we try to think of this as a region, and Cyprus as an important part of this region. Obviously, there is the exciting news about the Aphrodite field. We've been engaged on that. I think that provides tremendous opportunity for Cyprus to develop hydrocarbon resources. Obviously, it's hard to predict the future, but we suspect that the Russia's invasion into Ukraine and the subsequent follow-up with that is going to change energy markets for the foreseeable future, if not, for our lifetime. So, Cyprus has some resources. We're also looking at, we're also very interested in the so-called Asia Interconnector, which would connect Greece and Cyprus, which would allow Cyprus to develop its own renewable resources, take care of some of the intermittency problems, and further tie it to the European continent. Ultimately, that would extend into Israel too, to bring some more resilience there. We see a lot of potential synergies with Cyprus and their hydrocarbon resources, not only to fulfill European demand, potentially through the FSRU, which is in Alexandroupolis, providing an alternative route for gas to Central Europe that's not Russian. Egypt is booming, Egypt is growing, and they need resources. So there's another potential synergy there with connections between Cyprus's resources and Egyptian demand. When we talk about regional instability, it's no secret that what we do as diplomats is try to build economic relationships to bolster sort of political relationships, with the view that if you have an economic relationship, that's going to provide some ballast. So when there are political disagreements, they don't go completely off the rails because you have a lot of interested parties in the region that are interconnected economically. So we see energy as a big driver of further regional integration, and then hopefully with further regional integration, we have fewer conflicts. Finally, we're very pleased with, we have a great ambassador out there, Ambassador Fisher. She's really engaged in all this, and we're really pleased at the positive role Cyprus has been playing in the energy space. We see them as a country that's going to be able to drive this interconnection, and so that was in evidence with the strategic dialogue, the first one that happened a couple months ago. So from our perspective in the State Department, especially the Energy Bureau, we view Cyprus as a key in the East Med.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Erik. And then we'll go right to Simon Henderson on the specifics of the proposed pipeline. And we have the map up for edification here. Feel free to refer to that as well, Simon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to you to invite me here and so that I can talk about things here. I write a lot about East Mediterranean gas. I also look at Persian Gulf and energy there. And the first point I'd make is the world's or the region's energy, both oil and gas, is in the Persian Gulf. I'm sorry if you are from the Arab Middle East, but the United States government calls it the Persian Gulf rather than the Arabian Gulf. And so I'll follow that tradition. Where the gas is enormous, the three countries in the world which have the most gas are Russia, Iran, and Qatar. Russia and Iran vie for the top position, depending on how you count this stuff. Qatar is much less than that. But all three of them have multiples of the amount of gas which is in the Eastern Mediterranean. The gas in the Eastern Mediterranean is chiefly located north of, or both in Egypt, onshore, and mainly offshore Egypt. The gas which Israel has found is a big deal in Israeli terms, in that it more than meets domestic demand, but in international terms, it's almost insignificant. And my standard line, which may be a joke depending on the quality of your sense of humor, is that I have written many more words on Cyprus gas than Cyprus has actually managed to produce in terms of gas volumes, for which the answer is currently 0. I want to give you a little bit of context for the size of the problem, and this is particularly related to the Eastern Med, but actually applies across the world. The first one is that in terms of hydrocarbon resources are made up of oil, gas, and water. And if it's a majority oil field, it's called an oil field. If it's majority gas, it's a gas field. And if it isn't what you wanted or is depleted of the oil and gas, it's left with water, at which point you give up on it. The challenge of the Eastern Mediterranean is the water is very deep. And the fields, the resources which have been found so far are way offshore. There are one or two exceptions to that, but in Egypt, it's closer to the shore, but for both Israel and Cyprus, it's way offshore. That means it's expensive if you're going to try and get it out of there. It's also technically challenging at the cusp of difficulty, which is an additional expense. Having said that, the other part of producing oil, or in this case gas, is that you've got to get it to the market. And the challenge for Israel, as I said, was met because they found enough gas to serve the domestic market, and extra gas has gone to Egypt and also is exported to to Jordan as well. In the case of Cyprus, because of its small population, you don't need much gas, but your national pride beats and thinks, hell, if it's our gas, we should have it, we should use it. The technical and financial reality is, no, you don't. We'll have to think of another way around that, but the way for you need to use this resource is to export it. Because of this map, I will figure my comments now in terms of that map, is that if you can find enough gas off Cyprus, and if its volumes are exploitable, and if the volumes are, and if the economic logic for those volumes isn't to send it to Egypt, which is a main export center, the attraction is to send it to Europe. This has at least an element of increased attraction because of the Russia-Ukraine war, which means gas supplies within Europe have been disrupted. But currently, the amount of gas which could be exported from Cyprus, even including Egypt and including Israel, to get to Italy, as this pipeline suggests, is insufficient to really change the game. And the parameters of the game is you've got to think of a viability which is going to be at least 10 years, preferably 15, if not 20 years. That's the way the financiers of these fields try to work out the economic logic. Because without an economic logic, you can forget about it. I fear, because I take the dismal view of life, that Russia and Ukraine is not going to sort itself out soon and is likely to get worse rather than getting better. So this idea will remain alive in people's imagination, but the proposed East Med pipeline is going through extremely deep water. That makes it expensive and technically difficult. Without going too far into the Turkey factor, Turkey has this particularly unusual interpretation of where its EEZ extends to, which means that at the very least, from a Turkish point of view, you need Turkish permission for this pipeline. That's debatable, but sadly it's true. And then Crete doesn't have much of a domestic demand anyway. Greece itself doesn't have that much of a domestic demand, so you've really got to reach Italy before it becomes attractive. But that's expensive, and at the moment although officials make optimistic comments about this, I'll believe it when I see it, is my judgment on that one. I will stop here to open it up to discussion, but without wanting to be a damp squib on the whole of this morning's debate, I needed to frame some reality. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Simon, and thank you all. So you'll all notice that we put up the third map here, and this references what Simon was just talking about with the overlapping exclusive economic zone claims of the countries in the East Med. So the blue outlines are the exclusive economic zones that are claimed by Greece and by Cyprus respectively. And if you saw the news earlier this week, these were officially recognized by one of the bodies of the European Union and triggered a significant backlash from the Turkish government, which refuses to recognize these EEZs. And the red lines there are the demarcation point of what Ankara claims is its EEZ in the East Med. So we have these overlapping claims of a partial jurisdiction. These are not territorial waters or territorial airspace, with the ability to extract natural resources from beneath the sea and the seabed. But this is going to greatly complicate whatever is to be discussed between Turkey and Cyprus one day, hopefully, on the Cyprus problem itself. So we'll keep this up unless we need to go back to the other maps. And what I'd like to do is sort of ask everyone here sort of a couple of, we'll raise a couple of points, maybe put it in the context of a specific question, and then let's open it up for Q&A. And I was just advised by Nikolai Ragakis there's going to be an additional video as part of the morning program, so we'll end a little bit earlier. I'll take care of that. But I want to put this in a larger context that really comes back to the points that all four of you gentlemen have raised here. And that is that if there is to be a technically and engineering-wise feasible pipeline, and it's financially viable, in other words, not that governments would like to see this built, but that private companies will actually invest 6 to 10, maybe $12 billion to build a pipeline that many consider to be, again, technically very difficult, very challenging, because not only of the depths beneath the Mediterranean Sea, especially south of Castellorizo, but also we're dealing with a seismic issue, right? Earthquakes throughout this region. We have some political and economic potential obstacles as well. The US now is one of the largest exporters of LNG because of Europe's prior dependence on Russia for pipeline gas and for oil that's been cut off because of the sanctions placed on Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. And so is it in the US interest to see a genuine diversification of LNG supplies to Europe when right now we have a major role in that supply of LNG? Would this come at the expense of American LNG, or is European gas consumption demand going to increase enough to bring in both additional supplies, even if they're not vastly significant from the East Med, in addition to what we have from the US? But also there's the reality, ladies and gentlemen, I think, Simon, you mentioned this, that to invest in energy projects, you need 10, 20-year contracts. Well, the European Union remains ideologically wedded to these net zero 2035, 2050 targets, which means they plan to go all electric or other breakthrough technologies, solar, wind, possibly hydrogen, but moving away from carbon. So how do you square this circle where the European Union may be seeking additional carbon supplies when their politicians remain wedded to decarbonizing their economies? So I'd like to put this in the larger context of US energy interests, European Union commitments to net zero, an incoming Trump administration that promises to unleash American oil and gas production and export with the intention of bringing energy prices down in the years to come, and how this all plays into the East Med. Andrew, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
And then I'll let you all either come in as you wish, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
So I noted down a couple of things from the questions so that I don't think I'll get to all of them, but at least on three of them. The first thing with, because you mentioned pipelines and putting up the EEZs and the disputes over the EEZs, I think in addition to the points raised about the difficulties of constructing them, you know, in terms of money, in terms of technological difficulties, we also need to recognize the difficulty of maintaining them. So with regard to the war in Ukraine, for example, we saw pipelines in the North Sea blowing up. We've seen recently not an oil or gas pipeline, but an underwater cable recently was snapped in that region, and the Danes have actually impounded or held a Chinese vessel which they claim was responsible for snapping this underwater sea cable. It's actually really easy to do it. It's not very hard. And this should frighten all of us, right? Especially our Navy fellows in their nice blue uniforms. You know, it's very easy for a ship to kind of just go underwater and hook something and rip it out. And so it's not just a question of can we build a pipeline like this? Is it financially feasible? Does it make sense? Does it make sense for energy markets? Does it make sense for money-wise? But can it be protected? Or is it a vulnerability that you create? A second factor which we didn't talk about is where the other gas and oil comes, where the other gas and oil comes for Europe. So the war in Ukraine prompted European countries very quickly to pivot away from Russian gas. One of the most effective countries with this was Italy, and it managed to make up the shortfall from North Africa. So countries in North Africa, we mentioned Libya, but there are lots of other countries. I mean, Algeria, Tunisia also has oil, gas. I mean, these countries produce a lot, and they're much closer. There are existing pipelines, and so if the policy decision is there, they can easily switch to those suppliers to kind of make up shortfall. And I think that's what they're doing, at least as a first step. Now, the way this connects to your other question about the United States is, for a country like Italy, switching to North African gas is really easy because North Africa is right there. It's super close, and there's an existing infrastructure and existing relationships which Prime Minister Meloni has been building on to increase that. For other countries in Europe, it's not that easy. It's not that easy, for example, for Poland to get energy from the North Africa suppliers. So Poland is a huge market for U.S. Liquefied natural gas, as I understand it. They're one of the major importers of it. They may want to continue to do that as a policy decision because further, as in Mediterranean resources, are too far away to make the cost comparable, and they simply don't want to have any dependence on Russia whatsoever. So I think there'll be divisions within the European market of who feels like it makes sense for them to continue with an American option or a Gulf option. I mean, as you said, Qatar is the world's one of the world's largest suppliers of natural gas, so they have the resources to do that. Russia and Iran obviously being problematic for Europe for reasons now. In terms of their importation. So I think those three factors are quite important when we think about the policy decisions on the gas. The last point I would raise, because you mentioned this idea of net zero and ending fossil fuel dependency, those things are policy decisions, and so they can change based on who's in power. And so you mentioned there's going to be a change of administration in the United States from an administration which is more skeptical of that, or at least claims to be more skeptical of that. During the campaign, I was slightly confused because they also touting the fact that the Biden administration signed more gas leases than the Trump administration had. So there's always room for maneuver on that issue. But this is a policy decision of the European Union, and policies can change. And they can also get kicked down the road. I mean, we see also in Europe a renewed interest in nuclear energy. Again, Italy is thinking about, if we don't want to import gas, and we don't want to import gas from Russia, and we're committed to sort of less use of carbon, hydrocarbons, what can we do? Well, we can go back to nuclear. The French don't have a problem with this. The Germans have a bizarre relationship with this. But the German government is not going to be in power after February, probably. So it's going to be a new administration, and we'll see what they decide to do with that as well. So there are also other sources of energy that are not renewable and also not hydrocarbon.
Thank you. And Erik, I want to come to you. I believe you were not in your current position when the Bush administration had informed Athens back in early 2022 that they were going to withdraw whatever measure of U.S. government support for the original pipeline. But can you give us your perspective today? What is happening at state in terms of the potential energy diversification model for Europe?
Yeah, I think I'll make a sort of a broad point, is that for many of these questions, the market's going to decide. The people who are putting, massive capital plays, are, they're going to assess all this, including the political risk. So, as policy people, we try to understand, what the market's doing and what players in the market are doing. So, when we're talking about a change of administration, it was a little bit strange, our political debate here, because we're exporting more LNG than we ever have in the history of America, and we're the biggest LNG exporter in the world right now.
And oil.
And oil. And so, and this was in an administration that was, quote unquote skeptical, and we have a new administration coming in, and I'm not going to speculate on what their policies are going to be, but what they've said is we want to expand this, which is great, but that's hard because we're talking about 5 or 10-year leads. We're talking about investment. So when we look at what we're doing as far as energy policy, we try to frame our response as what's in the realm of the possible. And so the other dynamic here that I think is important to flag is as we move to AI, this is a tremendous drain on, I mean, it takes a tremendous amount of power to do this. And so, frankly, I think from our perspective in the Energy Bureau, green, not green, that's a bit of a misleading debate because we need all of the above. And as far as we're concerned too is, there's a net climate benefit when you are, when you're capturing methane, when you are using cleaner oil. So there's not an inherent contradiction there. And we'll see where Europe goes. But again, I think the market's going to decide a lot of these issues, and the market's going to market realities are going to force policymakers to sort of shift their positions one way or another.
Thank you.
If I may, before you...
Yeah, I want to come to you. Let me just preface your remarks with one sort of factoid here. I believe when President Sitilides was in Azerbaijan recently at the climate meeting, the COP29, I think it was, he gave a speech there where he also questioned whether or not there was an overly ambitious agenda towards achieving net zero targets on the part of Europe, and that a dose of energy realism might be required in certain European capitals. And it's interesting that it was the president of Cyprus who offered this in Azerbaijan and communicating it to his EU counterparts. Please.
Yeah, I don't think he's stating anything that isn't readily evident to a lot of people in that the net zero goals are admirable and should be pursued, but as we all know, you cannot pivot from one day to the next. There is a transition period, and fossil fuels, gas in particular, are going to be part of that transition. You need baseload, you need stability, otherwise the costs are going to be immense as we've seen. Again, I won't opine on Germany's views on what constitutes green and not. I do think that the odd relationship they have with nuclear will likely change. But before you go to Simon, because Simon touched on a few points that you raised, the pipeline itself, I don't think, has been really aggressively pursued for quite some time. I think it's widely understood that the volumes would make it challenging at best, as well as the other issues that were mentioned. For Cyprus gas itself, I also believe that as you said, the markets are going to decide, the companies themselves, Chevron, Exxon, are going to decide how to best exploit the reserves. The Exxon's activities in Block 5 are exceedingly encouraging, and the volumes potentially may exceed what Egypt currently has. The problems that we have that create obstacles to what otherwise would be smooth sort of market factors. In Exxon, it's Turkey's belligerence regarding Block 5 itself. When it comes to Egypt, and we discussed this briefly with Secretary Payet earlier this year, with the Minister of Energy of Cyprus, and this was, Egypt is facing its own financial difficulties, shall we say, and this proves to be problematic for the companies themselves because Cyprus gas to Egypt makes the most sense. However, that would require, at present at least, some sort of underwriting or bolstering from perhaps the US. We shall see whether or not that's on the table. Now, going back to the point you raised about Cyprus gas or East Med gas, whether LNG or otherwise, being viewed as competition for US LNG exports, I think, going back to Simon's point, the volumes are not sufficient to meet or satisfy by any means the demand of Europe, were the US to maximize its LNG exports to Europe. You have to consider other factors like the capacity for regasification, where it's going to go in Northern Europe versus elsewhere. I don't think those are mutually exclusive things. I also think it's much more challenging, as Simon alluded to, for East Med gas to be going to Europe. In fact, even if it were an LNG solution, it would more than likely end up going by the Suez to the Asian markets than it would to Europe. At least I believe that to be accurate. I'm not an expert on energy. Right, so I don't know if I've answered questions or asked more, but I'll pass that on.
So, Simon, one point, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience before we have to conclude. But Simon, please, your remarks.
To follow on to those remarks, we mustn't forget LNG as a potential way forward. LNG currently, and certainly in the past, has been more expensive to produce. It's a very expensive plant which squeezes the gas into a liquid and then exported on special tanker. But it does have the advantage that you can take it anywhere in the world, as opposed to pipelines where you can only get it to the other end of the pipeline, which might be a nice place today, but tomorrow or next year might have political problems and whatever, and the pipeline doesn't function any longer. But with the changing economics of which are sort of perpetually changing, LNG used to be particularly viable because it commanded high prices. If there's a lot of LNG around, the price will fall, and so the dynamics of these issues changes.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. All right, well, we have our first question, and everyone, please line up behind Jim Lagos. But Jim, go right ahead with the first question.
Gentlemen, first of all, thank you for being here. You made some very brilliant comments, and we're honored to have such experienced and brilliant individuals here at the conference. In terms of where we are right now, okay, and Mr. Henderson, you indicated, of course, that the pipeline has some technical challenges, which is obviously correct. On the other hand, in the Gulf of Mexico, we have pipelines and energy projects in waters that's 3 times as deep, but it's the deepest part of the Mediterranean. And we have hurricanes coming through there every year, which you don't have in the Mediterranean. And the worst storm in the Mediterranean is not 1/10 as bad as the worst storm in the North Sea. So where are we exactly, okay? And in terms of the pipeline, and Erik, you have the advantage of being both a lawyer and an engineer, I see from your biography. Yeah. And I know you've never designed a pipeline and so forth, but I would imagine anything that comes in the State Department of an engineering nature for pipelines would pass through your desk or whatever. Where are we exactly in the studies that have been done in terms of the pipeline, and in terms of maybe instead of a pipeline having an LNG factory, for lack of better terms, on Cyprus, and then ship it from directly there and forget about the pipeline, or perhaps have a huge electrical generating plant fired by natural gas on Cyprus. And we talked last night, I think, about the 2,000 megawatt electrical cable going under the Mediterranean. Where exactly are we on the studies and so forth? And this could be a question for any of you, but Mr. Henderson, and Mr. Holmgren, Erik, and Mr. Novo, or Mr. Constantine, exactly where are we exactly on this? What's the status of the latest studies, and exactly how much progress has been made?
Everyone, very quick answers.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe 2 more questions.
You're referring to onshore in Cyprus. The place is Vasilikos, I think it's, and one of my claims to fame is that I've actually been there. Most people haven't, it's because it's nowhere near a vacation resort. The point you make your own point, perhaps without realizing it, because the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea is close to the market. The East Mediterranean is not close to the market, and this is a major economic challenge.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think the economics right now, as we understand it, for the pipeline don't work. And we get that not from governments, but from private industry. We're not aware of any sort of capital being mobilized for the reasons outlined here, just the money, the technical difficulties plus the anticipated returns means, you know, the private sector, which has to do this, it has to be a private sector endeavor, they're just not motivated for economic reasons.
On the, if you like, very briefly, because you talked about the Eurasia Interconnector, or now referred to as the Great Sea Interconnector, where Cyprus and Greece signed a memorandum of understanding in September to move forward, connecting the grids of mainland Europe, mainland Greece, essentially through Crete, and then Cyprus and potentially Israel. Yeah, there's definitely potential there. The view is, for Cyprus, it's very important because it, even without the exploitation of our offshore gas, it alleviates the energy isolation of Cyprus, lowering costs and making the country more competitive. I think the answer on the pipeline is the answer, right? There's not enough volumes. It doesn't make financial sense. You can make arguments about energy security and so forth, but at the end of the day, private sector needs to buy it. So unless something changes dramatically or volumes far exceed what they currently are, it's unlikely.
If I could just jump in on the Asia Interconnector, the Great Sea Interconnector, there is private capital that's mobilizing to make that happen. There is European money to make that happen, and there are ongoing serious discussions with our Development Finance Corporation also to play a role in any sort of funding gap. So, you know, that's one that we're working on day to day. Chrissy over here has been living that. So that's one that we think is probably more realistic and accomplishes some of the same goals that we want as far as, you know, Cyprus's energy needs.
As regarding the pipeline, Ambassador Pyatt told us about 5 years ago, forget about it. So I don't think that's changed very much since then. But we go there every year to Cyprus, and one of our more interesting meetings is with their energy people there. And not to tie in an Aesop fable regarding a fox here, but we never get a straight answer. Who's spending money there? How much are they spending? What is the timetable? Can anybody here tell us exactly who's investing, why? Well, we know who's investing, but how much are they investing, and where does this stand after 13 years after its discovery?
Are you referencing the private companies?
Yes, exactly.
Well, I'll touch very briefly, and then I'll hand the hot potato off. You've seen this year some haggling, shall we call it, with Chevron regarding their obligations to move forward. They have obligations to the Republic of Cyprus to perform. But I think a number of factors affect how they, when I mean they, the private companies operate. As I said before, Egypt makes sense, but Egypt has a creditworthiness problem. So therein lies the rub, and then you need someone like the US to step in and sort of say, we're going to underwrite this transaction for the sake of stability of the region, for the sake of stability of Egypt, which matters especially now with so much going on. So it's justifiable, not for the interests of Cyprus, but for US interests in the region. This is where geopolitics and economics sort of overlap, and they do more so than perhaps we would like. Also, as we said, European policy about not supporting new fossil fuel endeavors and this, you know, very sort of hardline shift to the green transition also sort of makes it puts downward pressure on that area. But I think that's shifting, and I think we'll see movement relatively quickly. from this point forward. So,
I mean, I would just building on that point, because you mentioned the geopolitics of it. I mean, I don't know anything as much as these other gentlemen about the technological feasibility and the financial feasibility, but I think the reason why it hasn't changed in 13 years is because this is a political project. This is not an economic, it doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make energy sense, it doesn't make sense for the investors, it doesn't make sense technically to make it possible.
are you talking about the pipeline?
Yeah, the pipeline.
Forget the pipeline.
Yeah.
You're just talking about exploitation of...
Right, the pipeline. The pipeline is a political project, right? And it's meant, from John's map, to connect Cyprus to Greece, and to connect Cyprus through Greece to the rest of Europe. I mean, that's the way I see it. And so it's very unlikely that things will happen on the actual, bringing hydrocarbons out of the sea, putting them in a pipeline and shipping them to Europe, or to the rest of Europe, to Greece and to Italy and anywhere else, because it doesn't make sense except as a political project. There are two markets that are a lot closer that make a lot more sense. First is Turkey. That's a big country with a huge need for energy. That's not going to happen anytime soon. And the other market is Egypt, which we've talked about. And that's also problematic. But there's no political will to do that, because Turkey is not going to look to import natural gas from Cyprus. And Cyprus is not as interested in exporting natural gas to Egypt because it doesn't satisfy the political goal of connecting it more deeply with Greece and the rest of Europe.
I'm sorry, I'll disagree with you there. Cyprus is very interested in exporting natural gas to Egypt.
It can, yeah.
But it's a question of, it's not a decision for Cyprus to make, it's a decision for the companies to make.
And they don't think it's...
No, it's a question of well, there are several reasons that are being raised, but one is as I said, the creditworthiness.
Creditworthiness of
for Egypt to be able to pay.
So we'd love to sell it to you, but we don't trust that you could pay for it.
Essentially.
And, well, Erik, from a State Department perspective, I know you're monitoring where the U.S. companies are involved here. Can you give us any additional insight here?
Sure. I'll state a fact, which is, we're aware of these. We try to facilitate agreements. The Egypt point is well taken. There's some political risk there that the companies factor into their capital allocation decisions. But we don't know what's in those contracts, and they're not interested in telling us because this is close hold things, and we think we're trustworthy, but they would rather not have us be in the middle of these things, and frankly, we don't want to be in the middle of these things. So I don't know how much they're willing to invest. I don't know what their sort of return on investment is going to be, but we do know that U.S. companies are serious about investing in hydrocarbons in Cyprus's waters. So that's what I can tell you.
Thank you. Simon, please.
Just a small point.
Yeah, that's fine. Come up here. We can't make exceptions to the rules.
Simon?
Rules-based international order, remember?
Simon, go ahead, please.
A quick point on Aphrodite. One of the issues which has delayed it, and I think is still delaying it, but I'm not sure, is that a bit of Aphrodite actually extends into the Israeli EEZ, and the Israeli company or companies which have a license in that area are awkward about sorting out a deal with Chevron. It should be a straightforward, it's not the first time a field has overlapped, but it should be easy to sort out, but it hasn't been.
Thank you.
Yeah, very.
What about Phil?
He'll come up here.
He's right there. We have the microphone for him, Nick. Please, we just... Phil, are you going to ask a question, please? Here's your opportunity, because we're going to wrap up soon.
Somebody said this is not economic, it's political. You look at the map and what
The map
they,
before,
what,
map number 2?
no, this is the map in regards to the
EEZ.
exclusive economic zones and what has happened. From West Mitchell, when it came up on the State Department, and the excitement that followed in regards to the energy and hydrocarbon gas, and the expectations, which Mr. Henderson correctly said, the expectations are not there. However, when somebody says, politically, this doesn't work, well, it's also an opportunity. In the other map, obviously everybody knows that if the pipeline was going through Turkey, it would be a lot easier. Isn't this an incentive, basically, to reach some kind of a settlement with Turkey? Turkey has to compromise, has to come to its senses, be part of the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it's Israel, Egypt, the objections. Obviously, the pipeline going Cyprus, Crete, and reaching Italy, it's not viable, and everybody said that. On the other hand, also, I want to point out that the new administration is not so hot into the green energy as much as the present administration that was very anxious to kill the hydrocarbon gas situation. So in my mind, in this conference today, there's one objective. Where do we go from here in terms of after 50 years? And after 50 years of invasion and occupation, does energy offer an incentive to Turkey? And if it is an incentive to Turkey and the disputed exclusive economic zones, it is also a carrot that could be offered by the Cyprus government to Turkey in return for certain things. So it is a political situation. It is not economic. From an economic perspective, it does not make sense, everybody knows, but it is a political issue that could be resolved and could be used for the exclusive economic zones, and it could be used to settle and resolve the Cyprus occupation. That's the only thing that I wanted to point out.
Well, I would only say to that that my concern or my fear would be that it's not going to be enough, in the sense that Turkey's gas doesn't come from the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey's gas comes from the Caspian Sea. Turkey's gas comes from Azerbaijan. Turkey's gas comes from Russia. There are a lot of pipelines already running through Turkey. They run from Baku through Tbilisi to Ceyhan. They run across the Black Sea. And so I would defer to my colleagues over here about whether the volumes in, especially the Cyprus portion of the volume and the Israeli one, would be enough to really tip the scales.
Why is Turkey fighting so much on the exclusive economic zones? Why is Turkey disputing the exclusive economic zones? And why are they sending their ships to prevent the exclusive economic zones of Greece and Cyprus? It's a political issue.
It is, yes.
They want their influence. And the point that I'm making is that energy, whether it's not an economic issue at this point, it's a political issue.
Maybe I'll just say one quick thing, and I'm not going to get into the economic zone thing. I think all these sort of carrots should be on the table, and one of the things that we're encouraged about is the ongoing discussion with the Mitsotakis government and the Erdogan government. It's not going to get resolved without these talks. It's complicated, as we know. It's probably going to leave some sort of resolution is going to leave all sides unhappy to an extent, but we've been encouraged with sort of recent developments and sort of the willingness to engage in those discussions. So if energy plays a part of that to bring an ultimate resolution, that would be something I think the current administration and the incoming administration would strongly support.
Very quickly, I think if you want an answer to how the US can help move forward the exploitation of Cyprus gas, basically bring in the DFC and underwrite sale to Egypt. Done. Sorry.
Real
The
quick,
DFC is the Development Finance Corporation of the US. Sorry.
If I may, the United States is, my understanding, is one of the largest exporters of LNG.
The largest.
And they have no pipelines going anywhere that I'm aware of. As a matter of fact, Greece is one of the leading importers of U.S. LNG. Having said that, 13 years, nothing has come to the surface. There was a time there, obviously there's a lot of investment made by American companies and ENI and Conga and all the others that we know of, and that's just millions and not billions of dollars have been invested over these years. So there's got to be something there for these companies to invest in this. So ultimately, the hope is that something ultimately will come to the surface. Now, we've all agreed here that this pipeline is not viable for a number of reasons. But there was talk at one time regarding building an LNG plant on Vasilikos, okay? Which now my understanding, that was going to be about $6 billion, which is no, chump change. But if the gas is there, obviously the investment would be made. But there's also two underutilized, again, I don't know what the current situation is, in Egypt that were to be used as well, or can be used. So what, if any of this, can you tell us in terms of, these scenarios, and forgetting pipelines and so forth? And can you tell us, Aris, in terms of what, again, reminding the people in the room here, what is the official position of the Republic of Cyprus as it relates to all the people of Cyprus, as it relates to the energy future findings and how they share in that?
I think President Anastasiadis has been clear on that he considers the energy resources of Cyprus to belong to all Cypriots. That's the simple answer to that question. But on your more complex energy questions?
Egyptian LNG or plant is more attractive because Egypt has two of them, and one of them is underutilized and the other is non-utilized at the moment. It's much easier to rev them up again rather than build a new one. I think there's a particular geological challenge, if I remember correctly, to get Aphrodite gas on a pipeline to the mainland of Cyprus, because I think there's an undersea trench which is a challenge to cross with a pipeline. It has to go down and up again, and that only adds to the cost or the price.
Ships. We're talking about pipelines, ships.
Well, you've got to, the challenge is you've got to make it into LNG first. That's, you can't have a ship. We're only on the cusp of having ships which can sit above a gas pipeline, a gas field, and take the gas and convert it into LNG, and then take the LNG somewhere else. That's only done on a relatively small scale, and we're talking, in the case of Aphrodite, the volumes would require a larger ship, which is actually a vessel because it isn't really a ship, which is currently in your dreams.
Do we have time for one more question, Nick? Or there was a gentleman that was going to ask a question before. Can you, sir, that young guy right there? Yeah, but you're going to make it very, very concise, right? Because we have to wrap up.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your insights. My question has to do with larger energy picture in Europe. And I'm curious to know what the future of Russian gas looks like in the picture in a future where the war in Ukraine ends, and perhaps we see a rapprochement between Europe and Russia. We know the pipeline infrastructure is there to get the gas from Russia to Europe, and in the interest of economics, do we see a future where Europe turns to Russian gas once again, which would be considerably more economic than a hypothetical project such as this that has been 13 years in discussion? Just curious to know.
Thank you.
Your thoughts on that.
That's like another 90-minute discussion which we don't have, but if you can very quickly, anyone who wants to address that.
In your dreams of no politics in this world and just economics, it ain't Russian gas which will be supplying Europe in particular. It would be Iranian gas, which has got large volumes. There are already pipelines into Turkey. There are further pipeline plans slightly in your dreams to get it into Europe.
Anyone else want to touch this?
I'll just say one a line that my former ambassador Sunis would say, who has a number of hotels. He's like, I don't single source toilet paper. I don't single source detergent. And his point was, Europe had largely single sourced their hydrocarbons from Russia. And I think if the war in Ukraine taught the Europeans anything, and of course these pipelines go through Ukraine and they don't have to allow gas to pass too. I think you're going to see everything works out tomorrow, and there's a rapprochement, and I think you're going to have Europeans, continue to try to diversify their sources of hydrocarbons.
I'll push back on that, just because historically the Europeans have always said that they wanted to, but they never do, just like after Crimea. So I'm hopeful that you're right, but I think the Europeans are slow to learn lessons.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that the idea of not having a single supplier means that if and when the conflict in Ukraine ends, yes, Europe will start importing gas again from Russia. Probably, I can't imagine a world where they don't, simply because you don't want to have a single supplier. So Russia will be part of that picture. And two more points on that. One is there is simply too much money to be made to let it go. I mean, this is the Russia that bought Gerhard Schroeder. They can buy someone else. And very, very simply, right? And the second piece of that is Europe is not going to be entirely cohesive on this. We see massive changes in European policy over who they get gas from. Georgia, not an EU member, but Georgia under its previous administration had completely weaned itself off Russian gas and Gazprom. Georgia, with its new political party, which has been in power now for many years, brought Georgia back into buying gas from Russia. So if Georgia, which is occupied by Russia, can buy gas from Russia, I think European countries with different administrations who are more sympathetic to Moscow will also do that, because there's simply too much money to be made.
And Europe's importing gas from Russia right now. Maybe not through traditional ways, but that's actually happening right now. So I think we do see some sort of proof of concept here that even though they are getting gas from Russia, they are going to look at other sources, because it just makes sense. And the other piece about the Gazprom piece, I agree with your cynicism in a way, if I can say that. But you know, Russia has traditionally used gas as a political weapon. And, you know, to the extent you have an alternative, then you put yourself in a better bargaining position vis-a-vis price with Gazprom and also with the political pressure piece.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to close here. You have a richer sense, I think, of the complexity not only of this particular energy issue, which we've spent quite a bit of time on, but also how much we've widened the aperture in recent years on the U.S.-Cyprus relationship. The core issue remains the occupation of Cyprus by the Republic of Turkey and its military, but it's a far more robust and wide-ranging series of issues that we're able to now discuss: security, trade, energy, and the like, that makes this a more advanced and a much more positive relationship for the U.S. and for Cyprus in the years ahead, and hopefully facilitating the pathway to some type of an eventual resolution of the occupation. So on that, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their remarks today, and I thank you for your time and your attention.